Who's ready for the word today? So like I said, we're going beyond. We're going into new places, and we're doing things we haven't done, and God wants you to go beyond. But oftentimes when we think about going beyond where we've been, sometimes in the midst of that, we might ask ourselves this question: what if we don't go beyond? You ever thought about that? What are the implications of not taking a step of faith? What are the things that hang in the balance of not saying yes to Jesus, in walking in obedience and taking steps of faith to follow him and to move forward? What if we don't go beyond? I'm so glad you asked, because I want to help you see what I believe happens and what some of the things are that God wants us to learn through today's sermon and message. In the Old Testament, there's a group of people called the Israelites, and they're made up of 12 tribes. It's not a perfect analogy, but there would be like 12 states that make up the nation, like there's 50 states that make up the nation of the United States. They had 12 tribes that made up their nation, and it totaled millions of people. And so they had been delivered out of Egypt into the wilderness for God's destined promised land. It was this place that he had for them, a place where he was asking them to go beyond, a place that he had prepared for them and marked out for them. And he said, I've got a promised land for you. In fact, it's so good, they described it as it was flowing with milk and honey. Now, I don't really know exactly what all that means, but it sounds like it's good, okay? And so they described this place as theirs. It was like their rightful location they were to live. Well, as they've been in the desert for some time now, the Red Sea has parted. There has been what they call manna that fell from heaven when they couldn't eat. They didn't have anything to eat. God provided for them in the desert, in the wilderness. And in Numbers chapter 13 is where I want to pick up the story. Numbers chapter 13, verses 1 through 3 say this: The Lord said to Moses, who is the leader of all of the Israelites at this point, send some men to explore the land of Canaan. This is the promised land, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. So Moses is the leader of all 12 tribes, and he oversees the 12 leaders that oversee those tribes. And he individually selects these 12 people, and they're listed in verse 4 and beyond. And he says, go and explore as God has instructed us to. Explore the land. Go and taste and see what it's like out there that we have been promised to inherit. And so they spend 40 days out there on a 40-day camping trip. Sounds pretty incredible. And as they're out there, they start noticing certain things, and they pick fruit, big pomegranates and grapes that they hang across poles, and they want to carry it back to show the Israelites, this is what's out there. I mean, we hadn't eaten a whole lot because we're in a desert, and this place is like the Garden of Eden. And so they do this 40-day trip, and they come back to the Israelites, and we'll pick up the story in verse 27. These 12, they gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. One of the 12's name is Caleb, and in verse 30, he stands up and he says, He silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. A bad report. A bad report. It's interesting, sometimes when you encounter difficulty, adversity, and problems, you exacerbate the truth and make it seem worse than it actually is. And that's what these men were doing. They exacerbated it and they spread a false report, a bad report. They embellished a little bit because they weren't willing to go beyond. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. Here's where it gets really embellished and wild. We saw the Nephilim there. These are like the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim, which are these demigods that they're talking about. And they're saying that we saw the descendants there. They're huge people. And here it is. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we looked the same to them. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 14 says that night, verse 1 through 4, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. They went to explore the land. 12 different leaders looking at what God wanted to give them beyond where they were. 10 of them came back from exploring the land ready to leave entirely. They came back walking towards the camp physically, but they came back walking backwards spiritually. You want to know what happens if we don't go beyond? There are only two options. You can either go beyond or you can go backwards. So the title of today's message is this: backwards or beyond. By the way, there is no in between. I've realized that life is a lot like walking up an escalator that's going down. You are either fighting against the current and you are taking ground and going beyond, or you're going backwards, because the moment you stand still, there is no in between, for we cannot stay here. And 10 of these leaders say, wouldn't it have been better if we would have died in Egypt? In fact, let's go backwards. Let's walk backwards. Listen to me. Whatever you're praying for right now, it is beyond where you've been. It's beyond your comfort zone. It requires you to walk towards, but as soon as you get on the precipice of what you see beyond, like these Israelites, oh, they look big and strong. I don't know if I have what it takes. I'm not sure if I can go beyond. You better be careful, because if you don't go beyond, then you do go backwards. You're going to help me preach this today. It's a participatory church, okay? It's not a dialogue, it's a monologue. I'm sorry, it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. They started walking backwards. After all they had seen, after all they had been through, after everything that God had done for them, walking backwards is unnatural. Walking backwards is not the way that God intended us to go. He intended us to walk forwards. He intended us to take action and go beyond. But any time that we don't go beyond, there are reasons why. And those reasons are what I want to call beyond blockers that seem to block us from going beyond. Are you following me? They seem to inhibit us. And by the way, they're not Alan's ideas. They're written right here in the text that we've read. There's beyond blockers that seem to pop up. And 10 of the 12 people weren't willing to go beyond, and that resulted in them going backwards because they were blocked in their mind and in their spirit from what God wanted to do beyond. When we don't have the faith to go beyond, we tend to go backwards. And you don't have to. You don't have to go backwards before you go beyond. You don't have to. But listen to this, Numbers 14, 5 through 9. There's only 2 men that got to see the promised land and came back, and they were the 2 that wanted to go. Their names are Joshua and Caleb. Caleb you've heard from. They get together with Moses and Aaron, and the 4 of them, pick it up in verse 5, says this. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. The first thing that I see in the text that blocked them from going beyond, and it started them on a backwards trajectory, was when they said we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. That all of a sudden they started to see themselves a way that God didn't see them. They started to see themselves as the way they saw them. And they started to be absolutely riddled with the beyond blocker of personal inadequacy. Inadequacy has derailed more callings than arrogance ever has. Inadequacy will cause you to see the grasshopper in here instead of the giant out there. Sometimes it's not the giant out there that's such a big deal. Sometimes it's the grasshopper in here. They saw themselves as insects, squishable, small and tiny, inadequate to do what God asked them to do. It blocked them from going beyond. And it blocks us from going beyond too. Inadequacy means to lack what is required for a specific purpose. They reduce themselves to being these tiny insects by comparison, believing they would be squished because of their smallness. Inadequacy is something that has affected so many people in Scripture, not just them, but Moses, their leader, was affected with it. Moses felt inadequate when God asked him to go and speak to the Pharaoh of Egypt to let his people go. And he said, I don't know how to talk. I have a stuttering problem. I feel inadequate. And it was blocking him from going beyond. And God said, but if you trust me, come on, if you trust me and if you follow me and if you believe in me, he says something to him. He says, I'll be with you. And what's bad is we all have feelings of inadequacy. Not feeling qualified for a role, not feeling good enough to be a parent, not knowing how to lead, feeling like we can't be the man, the woman, or the person that God has called us to be. That's how these men all felt, inadequate to go beyond and take possession of the land. But Caleb never thought about the inadequacy of himself. Caleb, if you remember, he said, he stood up and he silenced him. He said, let's go take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. And everything he just said, he says, for if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into this land. Caleb never thought about the inadequacy of himself. He only thought about the adequacy of his God. The way you get beyond the blocker of personal inadequacy is to be reminded of the adequacy of God. Caleb knew that he served a God who was adequate to see him through this conquering season. He knew that God would lead them into the land. In fact, God even said in the very first verse that we read, go explore the land that I am giving to you. Beyond was a certainty. Beyond was guaranteed. Beyond was theirs. And he was just sitting back in heaven saying, I'm so adequate for the mission. I just want you to see it in advance before I give it to you. I'm giving it to you already. And Caleb sees this, and he doesn't see the grasshopper in here. He sees the giant up there. And when he sees that, he's contrasted by not being blocked and not going backwards. Come on, he's wanting to go beyond. The leaders felt personal inadequacy. Caleb felt God's adequacy. The leaders saw their own insufficiency. Caleb saw God's total sufficiency. The leaders had low self-confidence. Caleb had high God confidence. The leaders focused on giants to overcome. Caleb focused on God who overcomes. That if you want to be reminded of what it takes to go beyond, you'll feel inadequate most of the time. There's the rare breed that are in the 2. Most of us are in the 10. Including Paul in the New Testament, who wrote much of what we read in this book. He says in 2 Corinthians 3, 5, and 6, not that we are adequate in ourselves, so as to consider anything as having come from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. God doesn't respond to our fears of inadequacy with reassurances of our strength, but with a reminder of His. So it's not how do I feel, it's what does God say? What did God say? Not how I feel. And if you and I miss this, then you will not go beyond. So when you feel personally inadequate, remind yourself that God is adequate. Don't see your own insufficiency, see God's total sufficiency. When you have low self-confidence, be reassured of God's high confidence. Don't focus on your giants to overcome. Instead, focus on your God who overcomes, because if you miss it with personal inadequacy, you won't go beyond. You'll find yourself walking. This is not your destiny. You have eyes in front of you to see where you're going. But sometimes we get so fearful. Beyond blocker number 2, fear. That if personal inadequacy isn't the one that you got, if you're just confident as all get out, you got self-esteem through the roof right now, I mean, you just... I ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel today? You say 12. Fear is the other one that can drive us. Fear is a beyond blocker that can cause us to walk backwards. Fear gets everybody. Fear will get anybody. Fear's the great equalizer. Fear is this emotion that sees the future and all that it holds as dangerous and threatening to our overall well-being in some way. And it cripples us from moving forward. Because it requires that we move out of the comfort zone of where we are. So the only way around it is beyond. And fear will keep you right where you are and trick you into convincing that it's better to stay there. And you wake up one day and really realizing you've gone backwards, almost silently without even seeing it. As everybody else feels like, you feel like they've surged ahead, and it might be because of fear. Fear manifests in two ways almost exclusively. Fear of others and outcomes. What are they going to think if I make this decision? Fear of others. What are they going to say about me when I leave the room? Fear of others. What's going to happen if I fail and they think poorly of me? Fear of others. What happens if I look like a fool? To who? Others. What happens if I flop right on my face and I'm following God, trying to go beyond? What if they think less of me? Fear of others. And if we're not afraid of others, then we are afraid of the outcome. Fear of the future. Well, that outcome might require more sacrifice, and I'm afraid of that. That outcome might require more fight, because that was in the text. They still had to fight the battle, and I'm afraid of that. That outcome, I'm afraid to experience the emotion that might set in. And anytime we're driven by fear, we're vulnerable to be emotionally hijacked from going beyond into the future that God has for us. That fear will drive us into staying in places and going backwards because we're afraid of what others will think, say, tell us, or do, or we're afraid of the outcome that it may not actually work at all. There's really only two options, and everything that trails off can be hubbed out in those two ways. They block you from going beyond. And what I see in Caleb when he says, God will give us this land. Don't rebel against him. He will lead us into this land. He's not afraid. He tells them, don't be afraid of them. He literally calls it out. He says, I know you're afraid, but don't be afraid of them. I believe it is Joshua who, in Joshua chapter 1, God reminded him over and over and over again of one theme that helps us overcome the blocker of fear. It's this word courage. He says, Joshua, be strong and courageous as you go and you lead this nation. Caleb and Joshua, they had this courage that our God can do anything. Our God can do everything. And we are just pleased as punch to be a part of it. That who are we to live in fear after all that we have seen God do? Because you begin to start seeing that you can take courage, not just in your own strength, but in God's track record. God's got a really good track record. And so when you're afraid, that's why we sing songs like I trust in God. He's more than able. Because we start to see that his track record is good. And it gives us courage in him to do what he said he would do on our life. Courage. He tells this to Moses in Deuteronomy 31. He says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to go beyond in spite of fear. Courage in God is the ability to open our mouth and to negate fear of what others might say, because those things are true and real. But courage says, I'm not really worried about the outcome or the others because that's fear. I'm more worried about being obedient and being courageous to what God's called me to be. So I might feel fear, but fear is just the warning sign that it's my time to pray. And when it's my time to pray, then I begin to absorb God's track record on my life. And when I absorb God's track record on my life, all of a sudden, I start believing that He can do above and beyond all that I ask, think, or imagine. Not according to my good looks, strength, or will, but according to His power and purpose, which is at work within me. You've been equipped with a honing beacon from heaven so that you can tap into the Holy Spirit and receive courage from Him to march forward into your destiny. You have to have the adequacy of God, the courage from Him, and then the third thing that you got to get, and if you don't get it, 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 you don't get it, you'll peer over the edge of beyond and you'll start walking backwards. If you don't get it, if you're run by fear, if you're run by inadequacy, you just start walking backwards. But the other thing I see inside of these men, God explodes later on in this verse, and Moses has to calm God down. God was a different character in the Old Testament, okay? And he says, how long will these people not believe in me? Now, the scripture is replete with certain verses where men and women cry out to God and say, how long, God? How long must I wait? How long must I march? How long until you deliver me? But sometimes God's staring right back at us, and He's saying, how long until you really believe that I'm the God who is, who was, and is to come? How long must I wait on you to believe that I can do all that I said I would? And He asked this of them, which tells me that the third beyond blocker inside of this is simply doubt. It's doubt. They didn't really believe that God could give them this promised land. We look like grasshoppers in our own eyes. They're stronger than we are. We can't overtake them. And you combine all that with God saying, how long until these people just believe? Have I not proved my character to you yet? Because doubt starts to look at the future and believe that the future is too big for God to rescue. To believe that the future is too much of a vision for God to really deliver on. That sometimes that we begin to doubt that God will deliver on it. And that's where they're sitting. And if you look at all of this, you start to realize they had all kinds of problems. They had walked up to the Red Sea, and that was a problem. And they couldn't eat in the wilderness, and that was a problem. When they were in Egypt, they were enslaved for hundreds of years. And as they were enslaved to Pharaoh, having to work and be beaten, and there was a tyrannical leader, they were praying and calling out to God, and that was a problem. And every time that they had a problem, God had an answer. Every single time. Every single time that they had a problem, they would cry out and say, God, we got a problem. And so God talked to a man named Moses, and He sent Moses as the answer to their problem. Now, it took a long time. And so sometimes when things take a long time, doubt begins to creep in. Because it's not sometimes how strong your faith is. It's how long your faith can be. And every time they had a problem, God had an answer. But the timeline of the problem began to wear on them until they were sitting in doubt. And now they're at the precipice of taking the promised land, and they're creeping over the edge of it, looking to go beyond, and they see a problem. And they're so weary and worn out, they're just not sure. They're just not sure. They're not certain. They're not faith-filled. They're full of doubt that God's going to deliver this promised land to them. But because of God's good track record, He's always delivered a solution and an answer to the problem that they've prayed. Which tells me this, that just because God's not talking to you about the problem doesn't mean that God's not working on the answer. Just because you don't have a time frame around the problem doesn't mean that God doesn't have a delivery date on the answer. Just because God hasn't told you when it will happen does not mean that it won't happen. Because God's track record has been so perfect to provide every step of the way. And they see this obstacle in front of them that they think is too big. And the only way out of doubt is so simple. Is faith. That's the opposite of doubt is faith, and the opposite of faith is doubt. Sometimes people say the opposite of faith is fear. The opposite of fear is courage. We just dealt with that. But you got to have faith. Mark 11, Jesus is talking, 22 through 24. Jesus says, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. I want you to focus on verse 24. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. You know what I love about this verse? That when you take faith to go beyond whatever you're asking for in prayer, the concluding verse to that pericope is to believe that you have received it. That's an interesting word, Jesus, to believe that you have received it. To believe that you already have received it. I'm reading the text and I'm thinking that Jesus is going to say, and believe that you will receive it. Because that would make sense around the time frame. That one day I will receive it by faith. That one day through prayer and through courage and through God's adequacy and through faith that I will receive it. But it does not say that pray and believe in your hearts that you will receive it. He says, I'm better than that. Believe that you already have received it and it will be yours. This sounds like Joshua and Caleb. He's already given us the land. It may not be in our name yet, but He's already given us victory. He's already given us deliverance. We have already received it. Not one day we will receive it, but when we pray and we have faith and we don't doubt, and there's mountains around us that look like obstacles and giants that we can be enamored with fear and inadequacy and doubt. And He says, don't doubt, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. Because if you miss it, I don't know. If I can go beyond, it seems like I'll be walking I don't know if I can go beyond. It looks like I might be walking. And if you don't go beyond, then you are going to walk. You don't want to go backwards. How could you go back? To Egypt? In all those places? I'll tell you how. Doubt. Fear. Inadequacy. They block you from walking into the beyond places that God has destined all of us. Numbers 14:24. God's talking about Caleb, who we've read a lot about. He literally says this about Caleb. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. God says that about Caleb. He's like, the rest of these 10 and all that, I'll deal with them later. Let me tell you something about Caleb. Caleb doesn't have a spirit. Caleb got a different spirit. That's Bible. Rare breed. Uncommon. The first uncommon rare breed athlete of all time, Caleb. Caleb was D1 stuff. Caleb was NFL quality. Caleb has a different spirit. I got to looking at this word in the Greek and defining it, and I figured I'd just show it to you today. It's an adjective to describe something. It means not the same as another. You don't want to be the same as everybody else. Unlike in nature, form, or quality. In the Hebrew, it says, of another kind. We need people who are of another kind. We need people who are different than others. We need people who are not the same as the person next to them. Do you really just want to live your life and let your heart beat in your chest and then just die? No. You got to have a different spirit to follow God wholeheartedly, to say, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm going beyond. I'm not going to let fear and inadequacy and doubt overtake my mind, because I know that God is adequate, that I can have courage in Him, and that I can have faith in Him, and that I can follow Him into the beyond places, and that He would be pleased with me. You got to have a different spirit. That's my prayer for you as you're praying about God's beyond on your life. You're going to be like, some people in 2024 are going to be like, you look like an alien. You're of another kind. You're of another kind. I mean, you're just not the same. You're unlike in your nature, in your quality, in your form. And you can just look up and you can go, I got a different spirit. Oh, I know. I got a different spirit. What if we lived our lives with the belief that this man has in God? That God commends him for his faith, and he walks into the promised land. In fact, you don't even know the 10 people who went with him. Joshua got a whole book written about his leadership. Joshua got a whole book of the Bible. There's only 66 of them that went around, and Joshua said, I'll take one. You write my name in history because I follow you with wholehearted devotion. I got a different spirit to believe. I'm going beyond. Y'all can all go backwards if you want. I'm going beyond. I wonder what people will say about you years from now, about what you did for God, about what inspired you and motivated you to go beyond where you've been before. You want to be driven by all of these other things, then the only thing you'll get is more backwards. Or, in face of all that, you can take your spiritual life to a whole nother level. I'm talking a different spirit level. You can take your mindset to a whole different level. You can take your belief in God to a whole different level. You can take your commitment and your devotion and your wholeheartedness to God to a whole different level. And I promise you, this time next year, you'll have a list of things that God did that went beyond all you were asking, believing, or thinking of. Because that's what happens. To really sure up the whole story, Numbers 14, this is what happens to the people who did not want to go beyond. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about it. These men, who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land, were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb survived. The 10 died, 2 survived. If we don't go beyond, we die going backward. The only thing that you get, the only check written out to you is death. That's the point of the story. That if we don't go beyond, then we die going backwards. There is no in between. So what if we don't go beyond? That'd be a very sad version of all of our stories. It would be a very bad report about what's written of us. But may it be said of us, as it was of them, that these are they who have turned the world upside down. I want to live my life turning the world upside down for Jesus. I want to live my life just trying to hear those words at the end of it all. Well done, good and faithful servant, well done. Different spirit right there, well done. You did it. You didn't cave to fear. You didn't cave to doubt. You didn't cave to inadequacy. But you went beyond trusting me and believing me and having faith that I was who I said I would be. Stand with me today as I pray for you. Thanks for watching. Head over to vividchurch.com so that you can stay updated with all things Vivid Church. Join us in person or online for one of the services so that you can be a part of our Vivid Church family. But don't stop there. Please share this video so that we can help other people live the vivid story that God has for them. Thank you.